Understanding Judaism and Zionism thanks to Israel SHAHAK's book, Jewish History, Jewish Religion. Major features of classical Judaism following. From about 200 AD until the early 5th century, the legal position of Jewry in the Roman Empire was as follows. A hereditary Jewish patriarch residing in Tiberias in Palestine was recognized both as a high dignitary in the official hierarchy of the empire and as supreme chief of all the Jews in the empire. Note: so far as the central power of the Jewish patriarchate was concerned, the deal was terminated by Theodosius II in a series of laws culminating in 429 AD. But many of the local arrangements remained in force. End of note. As a Roman official, the Patriarch was vir illustris of the same high official class, which included the consuls, the top military commanders of the empire, and the chief ministers around the throne, the sacred consistory, and was outranked only by the imperial family. In fact, the illustrious Patriarch, as he is invariably styled in imperial decrees, outranked the provincial governor of Palestine. Emperor Theodosius I, the Great, a pious and orthodox Christian, executed his governor of Palestine for insulting the Patriarch. At the same time, all the rabbis who had to be designated by the Patriarch were freed from the most oppressive Roman taxes and received many official privileges, such as exemption from serving on town councils, which was also one of the first privileges later granted to the Christian clergy. In addition, the Patriarch was empowered to tax the Jews and to discipline them by imposing fines, flogging, and other punishments. He used this power in order to suppress Jewish heresies, and as we know from the Talmud, to persecute Jewish preachers who accused him of taxing the Jewish poor for his personal benefit. We know from Jewish sources that the tax-exempt rabbis used excommunication and other means within their power to enhance the religious hegemony of the Patriarch. We also hear most indirectly of the hate and scorn that many of the Jewish peasants and urban poor in Palestine had for the rabbis, as well as of the contempt of the rabbis for the Jewish poor, usually expressed as contempt for the ignorant. Nevertheless, this typical colonial arrangement continued as it was backed by the might of the Roman Empire. Similar arrangements existed within each country during the whole period of classical Judaism. Their social effects on the Jewish communities differed, however, according to the size of each community. Where there were few Jews, there was normally little social differentiation within the community, which tended to be composed of rich and middle-class Jews, most of whom had considerable rabbinical Talmudic education. But in countries where the number of Jews increased and a big class of Jewish poor appeared, the same cleavage as the one described above manifested itself, and we observe the rabbinical class in alliance with the Jewish rich, oppressing the Jewish poor in its own interest as well as in the interest of the state, that is, of the crown and the nobility. This was in particular the situation in pre-1795 Poland. The specific circumstances of Polish Jewry will be outlined below. Here, I only want to point out that, because of the formation of a large Jewish community in that country, a deep cleavage between the Jewish upper class, the rabbis and the rich, and the Jewish masses developed there from the 18th century and continued throughout the 19th century. So long as the Jewish community had power over its members, the incipient revolts of the poor, who had to bear the main brunt of taxation, were suppressed by the combined force of the naked coercion of Jewish self-rule and religious sanction. Because of all this, throughout the classical period as well as in modern times, the rabbis were the most loyal, not to say zealous, supporters of the powers that be, and the more reactionary the regime, the more rabbinical support it had. 3. The society of classical Judaism is in total opposition to the surrounding non-Jewish society, except the king or the nobles when they take over the state. This is amply illustrated in chapter 5. The consequences of these three social features, taken together, go a long way towards explaining the history of classical Jewish communities, both in Christian and in Muslim countries. The position of the Jews is particularly favorable under strong regimes which have retained a feudal character and in which national consciousness, even at a rudimentary level, has not yet begun to develop. It is even more favorable in countries such as pre-1795 Poland, or in the Iberian kingdoms before the latter half of the 15th century, where the formation of a nationally based powerful feudal monarchy was temporarily or permanently arrested. In fact, classical Judaism flourishes best under strong regimes which are dissociated from most classes in society, and in such regimes the Jews fulfill one of the functions of a middle class, but in a permanently dependent form. For this reason, they are opposed not only by the peasantry, whose opposition is then unimportant, except for the occasional and rare popular revolt, but more importantly by the non-Jewish middle class, which was on the rise in Europe, and by the plebeian part of the clergy, and they are protected by the upper clergy and the nobility. But in those countries where feudal anarchy having been curbed, the nobility enters into partnership with the king and with at least part of the bourgeoisie to rule the state, which assumes a national or proto-national form, the position of the Jews deteriorates. This general scheme, valid for Muslim and Christian countries alike, will now be illustrated briefly by a few examples.